the quiet that follows the guns when the armies moved on. The war did not end. It lingered in the silence of streets where boots no longer echoed, in the faint smell of smoke that never seemed to leave the air. This is the other half of war, not the battlefield, but the occupation, the quiet that followed the guns. Across the vast landscapes of Europe and Asia, millions found themselves suddenly trapped behind enemy lines, their nations conquered, their flags replaced, their laws rewritten. To the world, the front lines had shifted, but for those left behind, the war had just begun again in kitchens, in cellars, in ration queues, in whispers. A French schoolteacher from Normandy wrote in her diary on June 18th, 1940, when they entered, they did not shout. They simply walked, as though they already owned the air. The village square was quiet. We hid our flags in flour sacks. For many civilians, occupation was not an event, it was a slow suffocation. The daily life they had known, the sound of markets, church bells, songs, newspapers, all replaced by an unfamiliar authority. Every act became political. Buying bread, lighting a lamp, keeping silent. The invading powers called it administration to the occupied. It felt like the theft of normal life itself. Governments in exile fled. Armies surrendered or retreated. But for the people left behind, farmers, teachers, mothers, children, the war entered their homes. Occupation was not simply about territory. It was about control of time, of language, of thought. A Polish railway clerk recorded, "Every morning, we were made to salute the new flag. I felt my stomach twist each time I did. My father said, 'Do it for survival,' and so I did. Survival became our only flag." The early days of occupation were often marked by disorientation. In France, in the Netherlands, in Norway, civilians watched soldiers march down familiar boulevards, paying in foreign currency, requisitioning houses. In Poland and the Balkans, the shock was sharper, entire populations targeted for removal, imprisonment, or forced labor within days. As resistance movements slowly formed, others tried to adjust to find food, to protect families, to keep some semblance of order amid the collapse. Occupation created new hierarchies overnight. A shopkeeper who spoke the occupier's language could trade. A farmer with extra green could bargain. A mother who hid a radio could be shot. Fear became the quiet law of every home. A Dutch letter dated 1941 reads, "We no longer talk in the kitchen. The walls here too well. The sound of a knock after dark freezes everyone." Last week, Mrs. Van Dyke disappeared. Her husband whispered. She listened to London radio. Even whispers have a price. These were not isolated moments. Across the continent, a new reality formed, a world where people learned to measure every word, every glance, every gesture. The machinery of occupation depended on obedience and silence. It was enforced by police, informants, propaganda, and the ever-present threat of reprisal. But it also depended on something else: fatigue, the gradual draining away of the will to resist. For children, what was first silence was the most confusing. Schools closed. Teachers disappeared. Lessons stopped mid-sentence. A young boy in Kiev wrote to his older brother, who had been taken for labor. "They say we are liberated, but no one smiles. We have bread only if mother works for them. I do not play anymore. I wait." The innocence of daily life, play, school, laughter evaporated. Occupation taught even the youngest to read danger in footsteps, to know the rhythm of curfew hours, to sleep with shoes by the bed in case of sudden raids. And always, there was hunger. Hunger gnawed at the edges of every story, the currency of existence under control. In the towns of occupied France, the Germans requisitioned up to 80% of local agricultural output. In Poland and Ukraine, the Wehrmacht's hunger plan starved villages to feed the front. In Greece, famine killed more than 300,000 civilians in the winter of 1941-42, a catastrophe made invisible by censorship. An Athenian woman recorded in her notebook, "We eat soup of weeds. My father trades his coat for bread that is not bread. The baker says the flour is part dust. My brother sleeps all day so he will not feel hunger." Occupation was not just military control, it was biological control. To command food was to command people. Those who resisted the system: black marketeers, farmers who hid their grain, families who shared with the persecuted faced execution if caught. Yet even in hunger, humanity persisted. Neighbors shared, priests hid orphans, and secret letters carried hope through the narrowest cracks of fear. To live under occupation was to live in contradiction, to hate and to endure, to despise one's oppressor, but to depend on them for bread. to hope for liberation, yet fear what revenge might bring. This tension lived inside everyone, and in every diary, every whispered confession. It remains. A Belgian nurse wrote, "I treat their wounded because I am a nurse. My brother says it is betrayal. I say it is mercy. But mercy has become dangerous. The occupation transformed not only politics and economies, but private morality. Each person had to navigate a labyrinth of compromises. Sometimes doing what was right looked very much like doing what was wrong. And every day, survival rewrote the rules of conscience. For those who recorded their experiences in diaries, on scraps of paper, encoded letters, writing was not only memory, it was resistance. It was a way to reclaim humanity, to assert, I was here, I saw, I survived. A French teenager wrote in 1943, I write because they cannot control the inside of my mind. They can take the cows, the food, the house, but not this page. Each of these fragments, the words of ordinary people, forms a mosaic of suffering and endurance. They reveal what history books often leave blank. The private war waged in kitchens and fields, in silence and secrecy. The occupation may have been military, but its most lasting battlefield was psychological. When we look at maps of World War II, we see arrows, borders, movements. What we don't see are the people inside those shaded areas they occupied, those who lived for years under watchful eyes, rationed lives, and constant fear. The true measure of occupation was not victory or defeat, but how deeply it reshaped what it meant to be human. In the next chapter, we'll descend deeper into that daily struggle, into the hunger, the black markets, and the desperation that defined existence under foreign rule. For those trapped in occupation, every meal was a decision, and every decision could mean life or death. The slow siege, hunger, scarcity, and the battle for food before occupation. Hunger was a hardship. During occupation, it became a weapon. Across Europe and Asia, civilians found that their stomachs were no longer their own. Food, its absence, its control became a quiet frontline of domination. A small card decided survival. A name, a number, a weekly allocation. Bread, potatoes, sugar measured in grams. Not goodness. A woman from Warsaw wrote, I am allowed 200 grams of bread per day. I measure each slice like gold. Sometimes I lick the crumbs from the table. I have stopped dreaming of meat. The German occupation authorities, and later the Japanese in Asia, perfected the bureaucracy of deprivation. Food became a ledger, and every ration card was both a promise and a threat. Those who obeyed received their crumbs. Those who resisted starved. But human hunger has its own intelligence. Where governments rationed, people improvised. A secret economy emerged in the shadows. The black market. In occupied France, eggs sold for 20 times their official price. In the Netherlands, entire food trains carried stolen goods under blankets and night fog. In Belgium, children smuggled butter under their coats, running from gendarmes. A letter from a Dutch farmer to his sister reads, We are thieves now, or so they say. But when the law is hunger, theft becomes family duty. Last week, I traded 4 eggs for 1 tin of coffee. It tasted of ashes, but it felt like defiance. In cities, the poor suffered first. The rich, those with jewelry or hidden reserves, could barter for months. But by 1943, even the wealthy faced empty pantries. Hunger did not respect social class, it only respected access. Waiting became an occupation in itself. Waiting in lines for bread that never arrived. Waiting for rumors of supply trains. Waiting for spring crops that might not come. In Greece, thousands collapsed in bread queues. In Denmark and Norway, mothers diluted milk with water and fed their babies sugar water when cows were taken. In China, villages under Japanese rule boiled bark to survive. Historians call this the slow siege when no bombs fall, but people still die. And across occupied territories, it played out the same way. First the shortages, then the substitutions, then the deaths. A ration in Paris in 1942 provided roughly 900 calories a day, less than half of what a working adult required. In Warsaw, it dropped below 700. In some parts of Eastern Europe, Jews and prisoners received less than 300 calories per day, a death sentence stretched across weeks. A Polish mother wrote to her sister, My son stopped crying when the bread was gone. That frightened me more than his hunger. When children stop crying, something in the world is broken beyond repair. The occupation's cruelty was not only physical. Hunger became psychological torture, the slow unraveling of dignity. Neighbors stole from one another. Friends lied to survive. A loaf of bread became currency for betrayal. In one occupied village in the Balkans, Locals still remember how the Germans would offer loaves to informants' rewards for turning in partisans or hidden Jews. The cruelty was efficient. People betrayed others to feed their own. And yet, amid scarcity, there were acts of immense compassion. In the ghettos of Poland, secret soup kitchens run by teachers and rabbis fed hundreds each day with what little could be found. In occupied France, nuns grew vegetables in hidden gardens for orphans and the elderly. In Belgium, railway workers risked execution by diverting food trains. A French nurse's journal reads, "I stole a potato from the German kitchen. I boiled it and shared it with the children. We laughed while we ate. The sound of that laughter frightened me. I had forgotten it could exist." Hunger reveals humanity in both directions: cruelty and courage, selfishness and sacrifice. And under occupation, both lived side by side in the same streets, sometimes in the same person. As the months dragged into years, people adapted in strange ways. Recipes changed. Flour was mixed with sawdust, bread with straw, soups with wild plants. What began as necessity became routine. In Holland, families boiled tulip bulbs for meals. In the Philippines, villagers under Japanese rule mixed rice with banana peel. In Ukraine, peasants ground acorns and baked them into bitter cakes. A diary from a young girl in Rotterdam reads, "Mother told me to close my eyes while I eat. That way I can pretend it is cake. Sometimes I believe her." For children, the memory of taste became mythical. A piece of chocolate, a miracle. A slice of bread, a celebration. Even today, survivors recall the texture of those imagined feasts. But food was also a tool of control. Occupiers rewarded loyalty with rations, punished resistance with starvation. In France, the milice collaborationist police distributed food only to those deemed cooperative. In Poland, Jews were excluded entirely. In parts of China, entire villages were cut off as punishment for harboring guerrillas. A Chinese villager recalled decades later, "They burned the fields. We ate the roots. We buried the children where the rice once grew." This was not mere deprivation, it was policy. To weaponize hunger was to enslave without chains, to make people too weak to resist, too desperate to dream. And the occupiers knew it worked. Every empty stomach was another voice silenced. Yet starvation also inspired defiance. In occupied Poland, secret farmers' cooperatives smuggled grain to cities. In Greece, black market traders risked death to bring food from the countryside. In Denmark, fishermen ferried food and sometimes people across to Sweden. One fisherman wrote in his logbook, "We carried sacks of potatoes in daylight and Jews by night. The sea took some, the Germans took others. But better to drown than to starve with eyes open." Hunger, paradoxically, united the occupied. It reminded them that they shared the same empty plate. And through that shared suffering, quiet networks of solidarity grew: churches, small farms, underground kitchens. Even a single hidden loaf became a symbol of resistance. But there was another cost, one that lasted long after liberation. Malnutrition scarred bodies permanently. Children born during occupation grew up smaller, weaker, more prone to illness. Decades later, scientists studying wartime generations in Holland and Greece found the same pattern. The human body remembers hunger. A Dutch survivor, interviewed at age 80, said, "I still hide biscuits in my drawer. I cannot eat without fear that it will run out." The occupation ended, but hunger never really left me. Under occupation, hunger was not an accident. It was deliberate, an invisible front line drawn through every kitchen, every stomach, every human soul, and for many, it was the first time they learned what war truly meant: not bullets, not bombs, but the slow, daily erosion of hope. In the next part, we turn to those who lived under the shadow of reprisal, the price of defiance, the terror of collective punishment. For in occupied territories, courage itself was a crime, and when resistance spoke, retribution followed. Hunger, fear, and survival. Daily life under occupation in every occupied city of Europe. The silence after the invasion became its own kind of terror. The sound of tanks faded, but the echoes of control lingered in ration lines, whispered conversations, and the hollow ache of empty stomachs. Act 2. All citizens must report food reserves. Hoarding is punishable by death. The message was clear. The occupiers would not only command your land, they would command your hunger. The hunger war under Nazi and imperial occupation. Food became the currency of obedience. In Poland, Ukraine, the Netherlands, entire harvests were seized for the Reich. In France, quotas stripped farmers' barns bare. And in Greece, where blockade and confiscation combined, famine swallowed entire cities. In Athens, 1942, the bakeries were empty. Streets once alive with markets turned into graveyards of hunger. A survivor, Eleni Nicolaou, wrote in her diary, "My mother boiled the grass from the garden. My brother found a cat and cried as he carried it home. We prayed before eating it. By winter's end, an estimated 300,000 Greeks had died of starvation." Ration books and the black market in occupied France. Even the simplest meal became a moral question. Bread was rationed by grams, meat by luck, and coffee replaced by roasted chicory. The government issued ration cards marked J for Jewish branding, not just people, but their right to eat. Families kept their ration books as they would keep their hearts guarded, fragile, essential. We traded my mother's wedding ring for 2 loaves of bread. It felt like selling love for life. The black market thrived in the shadows, traders dealing in butter, tobacco, and hope. Farmers risked their lives to smuggle potatoes under hay, while city dwellers whispered passwords in alleyways. Occupation blurred morality. Stealing became surviving, and survival itself became resistance. Fear as a constant companion, the occupiers didn't need to always be present. Their absence was often more frightening. Curfews turned nights into prisons. A knock on the door at midnight could mean a son taken for questioning, or a father never returning. In Warsaw, fear lived in every heartbeat. German patrols haunted the streets. The sound of boots meant danger. The silence after meant loss. Sound cue, slow echoing footsteps. Then a door creaks open. From the diary of Janina Lewandowska, 1941. They came for our neighbor. His wife screamed into the street. But no one moved. We closed our shutters, and I prayed not for his return, but that they would not come back. The occupiers ruled with randomness, the cruelest weapon of all. Punishment was collective. For every act of resistance, entire villages could burn. In the French village of Oradour-sur-Glane, 1944, 640 civilians were massacred in retaliation for a partisan attack. Children locked inside a church. Mothers shot in fields. These reprisals weren't accidents, they were theater. Terror was the script, and the audience was everyone still alive. The silent resistance seat, even in hunger and fear. Defiance survived quiet, human, and unyielding. In occupied Norway, teachers refused to indoctrinate Nazi propaganda. In Belgium, printers forged identity cards to save Jewish families. And in the Netherlands, housewives hid radio receivers beneath their floorboards to listen to forbidden BBC broadcasts. This is London. The war is not lost. For millions, those words were oxygen. A letter from Amsterdam, 1943, signed only L. We pass news like bread, small pieces, broken and shared. It keeps us alive. Children of the occupation for children. The occupation rewrote childhood itself. Playgrounds turned into air raid shelters. Laughter became suspicious. Many learned to recognize uniforms before they learned to read. In every school, lessons carried new rules. Salute the flag of the occupier. Repeat the slogans of control. But behind closed doors, mothers whispered real history, the one not written by invaders. From the diary of Marie-Claire Dubois, age 12, Normandy, 1943. We draw maps in secret. My brother says one day the lines will move back. I asked him when. He said when the sky stops crying, children became messengers, runners, even smugglers unnoticed by soldiers who saw them as harmless. But innocence never returned. For many, the war would outlive their youth. The quiet collapse of trust occupation was not only about foreign power, it was about betrayal among neighbors. Collaboration crept through communities like rot under paint. A friend might be an informer. A cousin might wear the armband of the enemy. When the line between survival and treason vanished, suspicion became the only law. From a diary in Warsaw, 1942. I cannot look at anyone too long. Eyes can kill now. The price of dignity, and yet even amid starvation, fear, and moral collapse, civilians clung to small acts of humanity. A loaf shared in secret. A prayer whispered for a missing friend. A piece of music played softly in defiance of silence. In Paris, a cellist performed in the ruins of a bombed theater. In Poland, underground schools taught band history. In the Netherlands, a mother taught her son to write his name not in fear, but in faith that someday he'd sign it freely. The occupation sought to break the human spirit. Instead, it revealed how deeply it could bend and not shatter. By the third year of occupation, millions across Europe had forgotten the taste of freedom, but not its meaning. And in the quiet resistance of the hungry, the afraid, and the silenced, the first sparks of liberation were already being kindled. German broadcast archival voice. For your protection, For your prosperity, trust in the Reich. Control during occupation did not come from the barrel of a gun alone. It came from the words on a poster, the voice on the radio, the eyes watching from every corner. Across Europe and Asia, occupation forces built invisible empires not of territory, but of obedience. And their most powerful weapon was belief itself, the theater of obedience in every occupied town. Propaganda became a daily performance, one that blurred truth and fear until they were indistinguishable. Posters promised order. Films showed soldiers as protectors. Newspapers carried headlines approved line by the Occupy censors. In France, the Vichy regime called collaboration the path to renewal. In Poland, Nazi-controlled papers declared Jews and partisans parasites. And in China, Japanese occupation forces launched New Order radio broadcasts, praising cooperation with Tokyo. Sound cue. Faint music from a wartime newsreel from a 1942 letter in Paris. They tell us we are brothers now. But I've never seen a brother with a rifle at my door. Words as weapons propaganda was not only about persuasion, it was about exhaustion. When lies surrounded you long enough, truth itself began to lose meaning. In the Netherlands, resistance printers secretly retyped forbidden BBC transcripts and distributed them as leaflets. Every copy was a risk of death. Every word, an act of rebellion. A whisper became more powerful than a speech. A rumor could spark a movement. And so, the occupiers hunted whispers as if they were bullets. The occupation police stated Gestapo, Kempitei, Sippo, names spoken in low voices. Names that meant one thing: fear. These organizations turned neighbors into informers and homes into interrogation chambers. In Warsaw, the Gestapo headquarters at Aleja Suka became known simply as the House of Death. In every occupied territory, similar buildings appeared ordinary in appearance, monstrous in purpose. Their task was not just to punish the body, it was to terrify the mind. From the testimony of Lucien Grubber, a French railway worker arrested for sabotage. They blindfolded me. I could hear the others screaming. That was the torture, the waiting, the knowing what might be next. Fear became a contagion. One arrest could silence an entire street. The war on thought occupiers understood that to control a people, one must first control what they think. Schools were rewritten. History was edited. Children learned loyalty not to their flag, but to the flag flying above it. In Norway, teachers were ordered to swear allegiance to the Nazi puppet regime. When they refused, over 1,000 were sent to labor camps from a letter smuggled out of Kirkins. We teach in secret now. Chalk and hoe pile weapons. In occupied China, Japanese-run re-education centers taught surrender as enlightenment. In Vichy France, textbooks spoke of France reborn through cooperation. Each lesson was a quiet war against memory itself. Censorship and silence. The occupation censored not only speech but silence. Letters were opened, redacted, rewritten. Words like freedom, resistance, or even hunger could bring suspicion. In Belgium, one postmaster recalled, every envelope was a confession waiting to be found. To write truth became a subversive act. To speak it aloud was treason, and so entire communities learned the art of coded language. A loaf of bread might mean a message. A church bell might mean danger. A child's song might hide the signal to run. Collaboration and betrayal. No regime can exist without helpers. And in occupied lands, collaborators emerged not always from loyalty, but from desperation. Police, clerks, translators, men and women who once served their own people now enforced the enemy's rule. Some did it for safety, others for survival, a few for power. But collaboration was a poisoned choice. Even those who cooperated found themselves haunted, distrusted by their neighbors, discarded by their masters. From a post-war confession found in Normandy, I thought I was saving my family. In the end, I lost them anyway. The spy beneath propaganda was the voice of occupation. Surveillance was its heartbeat. Every town had its informers. Every whisper could find its way to an officer's desk. A diary from Amsterdam, 1943. We no longer talk in our own kitchen. The walls have ears, and the ears have names. It was not paranoia. It was survival. In Poland, neighbors denounced neighbors for a loaf of bread or promise of safety. In France, the milice, a paramilitary police loyal to Vichy, hunted Jews and resistance members with terrifying efficiency. Trust, once broken, became the rarest currency of war. The propaganda of fear. Occupation propaganda eventually ceased pretending to inspire. It existed only to warn. Posters threatened death for resistance. Speakers broadcast lists of those executed. Bodies were left hanging in public squares, a silent message. This could be you. Terror became communication. Fear became governance. From a Czech teacher's journal, 1943. We stopped looking at the posters, not because we believed them, but because we couldn't bear to see another name. The resistance of the mind, and yet, even under the weight of total control, the mind remained a battlefield the occupiers could never fully conquer. In the dark attics of Amsterdam, Anne Frank wrote not only her fear, but her defiance. In Poland, underground universities taught forbidden knowledge. In Greece, poets recited verses by candlelight, whispering lines that carried more power than any speech of a general. Each hidden act of thought was a quiet revolution. The cracks in the machinery 1944. The machinery of control began to grind and falter. The radio lines grew thinner. The posters faded in the rain. And through the whispers of hope allied landings, partisan victories, a new language began to spread. Sound cue, a faint radio crackle, distant thunder of artillery. A letter from Lille, May 1944. The broadcasts say they are coming. For once, I believe it. Even the soldiers look afraid. Control, once absolute, began to fracture under its own weight. Because fear, though powerful, is never eternal. The occupiers had conquered nations, silenced voices, rewritten truth. But beneath every poster, every curfew, every lie, the human spirit had waited. And soon it would speak again. Chains of labor, forced work, deportation. And the stolen years' war is not only fought on the front lines. It's built by hands that never held a weapon, by workers who never volunteered, by millions whose lives were reduced to labor and obedience. Across occupied Europe and Asia, men and women were torn from their homes, branded as Arbeitskraft work units, and sent to toil for the empires that had conquered them. They were the invisible soldiers of the enemy, constructing the very war that was destroying them. The machinery of enslavement in 1942. A decree spread across the Nazi-occupied territories. Every able-bodied person must contribute to the German war effort. Behind that line lay the creation of one of the largest systems of forced labor in modern history. Factories in Germany ran on the sweat of millions. French farmers, Polish miners, Soviet prisoners, Dutch engineers. They worked under the watch of the Gestapo and the promise of punishment. From a 1943 letter smuggled out of a labor camp near Essen. We worked 12 hours, sometimes more. The air burns with coal dust. They say our rations depend on our output. Yesterday, a man fainted. They carried him away, and his number was erased. Every day, tens of thousands collapsed at their posts. Every night, the trains brought more replacements. The roundups in occupied France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The service du travail obligatoire, the compulsory labor service, turned the hunt for workers into another kind of deportation. Soldiers patrolled train stations and town squares. Young men were seized from cinemas, markets, even churches. Families hid sons in barns or forest huts, disguising them as farmers. Priests, or cripples to avoid the summons. From the diary of Jean Roussel, 1943. They came at dawn. We heard the trucks before we saw them. Mother told me to run. I ran into the woods. I could still hear her shouting my name. Those who were caught were sent across Europe to the Ruhr, to Bremen, to Stuttgart, factories of war where laborers were both essential and disposable. Each train that left was filled not with soldiers, but with sons and fathers turned into slaves of industry. Life in the factories of the Reich forced labor camps were not concentration camps, but they shared their cruelty. Workers lived in wooden barracks surrounded by wire. Food was scarce, the air choked with smoke, and the overseers carried whips as often as tools. Accidents were common, deaths uncounted. In German armament plants, laborers were referred to as pieces, Saint CK, not people. From a Polish miner's testimony. Stanislaw Wozniak, we were told to keep working even when bombs fell. They said if we ran, we'd be shot as deserters. When the ceiling collapsed, they gave us new shovels, not bandages. The camps of Industrie 1944. Over 7 million civilians from across Europe were working inside Nazi Germany. The Reich had become a giant prison of production, its economy fueled by captivity. In Austria, the Morthausen complex combined industry with annihilation. Stone quarries worked by prisoners until they collapsed from exhaustion. In France, the Renault and Citroën factories were forced to produce vehicles for the German army. Under the eyes of guards and spies, work became both weapon and punishment, a tool to erase individuality. From a letter found in the ruins of a dormitory near Hamburg. We dream of sleep, but even in sleep we work. I see the machines in my dreams, turning without me. Women in captivity occupation labor did not spare women. They were sent to clean barracks, nurse soldiers, or sew uniforms in commandeered factories. Some were drafted into domestic service, phrase that concealed the truth of exploitation and sexual abuse. For many, captivity meant servitude not just of the body, but of dignity. From the diary of an Averbeek, Netherlands, 1943. I scrub their floors by day and pray they do not call for me at night. There is no word for what this life is only waiting in the East. The Japanese occupation created the most tragic form of forced labor, the so-called comfort stations, where thousands of women from Korea, China, and the Philippines were enslaved, their voices, often silenced for decades, tell of a pain that outlasted the war. Excerpt. Survivor testimony translated. They said we were helping the army, but we were just girls. They took everything, even our names. The stolen youth children, too, were not spared. In Eastern Europe, German authorities abducted children deemed racially suitable to be Germanized, while others were sent to factories and farms. In occupied Poland, young boys worked on road crews, hauling stones heavier than themselves. In Ukraine, girls as young as 12 were shipped to Germany as maids. The war turned childhood into a labor shift, play replaced by obedience, dreams replaced by survival. A 1940 diary fragment from a Polish boy named Marek. Age 13. We work until the sky is dark. My hands bleed, but I am not allowed to stop. I miss my dog. I think he would still know me. Resistance to Labyrinth in bondage. Defiance found its way into the cracks of machinery. Sabotage became a hidden weapon, a bolt misplaced, a part left unfinished, a spark delayed just long enough to fail. In every workshop, small acts of rebellion whispered, "We are still here," from a letter by a French mechanic in a Messerschmitt plant. "We tighten the screws just enough. A plane will fall someday, and they will not know why." Such acts came at enormous risk. Court saboteurs faced public hanging, sometimes alongside their CEO workers. But even in death, they proved that captivity could not erase conviction. The long road home when liberation finally came. Millions of forced laborers were freed thin, broken, and scattered across a shattered continent. But freedom did not bring peace. Many returned to find their families gone, their homes destroyed, their countries changed. They had given years to a war they never chose, and what waited for them was silence. From a post-war letter written by Jean Rousseau, the man who had once fled into the woods. I came home. The house is empty. Mother's chair is still by the fire. Sometimes I think I still hear her calling my name. The war had ended, but for millions of laborers, the occupation had carved its scars too deep to ever fully heal. History often remembers those who fought with weapons, but the war was also built by those who fought simply to survive their work. Theirs was a battle without medals, without borders, a struggle measured not in victories, but in endurance. Living shadows. The Jewish experience and hidden lives in the cities and villages of occupied Europe. There were two wars, one fought in the open, and another waged in silence, underground, behind walls and beneath floorboards. For the Jews of occupied Europe, survival became a secret, a life lived in whispers, shadows, and the constant fear of discovery. They were the hunted not for anything they had done, but for who they were. Theirs was the story of vanishing, of families erased, of names hidden, of hope surviving only on scraps of paper. The beginning of exclusion before the roundups, before the camps, came the decrees. Each law, each order, stripped away something ordinary, a business, a home, a right to walk in certain streets. From a 1941 ordinance in Paris, Jews must wear a yellow star on the left breast. They may not be outdoors after 8 p.m. soon. The world around them began to disappear. Neighbors looked away. Friends crossed the street. The invisible walls closed in. From the diary of H. L. Neber, Paris, 1942. I put on the star this morning. I looked at myself in the mirror and cried. I feel branded, like an animal, but I will not let it change who I am. For the Jewish people of Europe, identity itself became a crime. The roundups, the occupation's cruelty, was systematic. Every raid, every list, every whisper in the night was part of a machinery designed not just to kill but to erase. In occupied France, the Veldiv roundup of July 1942 marked one of the darkest days of the war. Over 13,000 Jews, including 4,000 children, were dragged from their homes and held in a Parisian sports arena without food, water, or air. A surviving nurse later wrote, The smell of sweat and fear filled the air. Mothers tore their clothes to fend their babies. The children kept asking when they could go home. They never did. From Poland to the Netherlands, from Hungary to Greece, the pattern repeated: ghettos, deportations, trains. The rhythm of annihilation disguised as order. The ghettos in Warsaw, Lodz, and hundreds of smaller towns. Ghettos became prisons of starvation and disease. Barbed wire divided life and death by a street's width. Inside, families huddled in unheated rooms, living on scraps of bread and rumors of what lay beyond the walls. From the Warsaw Ghetto Diary of Cain Kaplan, 1941. Hunger is no longer a visitor. It has moved in with us. We count the days by funerals in the Lodz ghetto. Children smuggled food through holes in fences, risking death for a potato. And yet, even in the darkest corners, there were sparks of humanity: underground schools, secret concerts, even weddings whispered through tears. They refused to surrender the dignity that the world had denied them. Hidden lives beyond the ghettos. Some found fragile refuge among the occupied populations hidden in basements, attics, barns, and convents. In Amsterdam, Anne Frank and her family entered hiding in July 1942. For 2 years, they lived in silence behind a movable bookcase, a small island of existence amid a sea of danger. From Anne's diary. I hear the clock strike. I hear the bells outside. But we cannot look. We cannot go. Every footstep might be the end. There were thousands of Anne Frank's children and parents hidden by the brave and the compassionate. In France, the village of Elie-Chambon-sur-Lignon sheltered over 3,000 Jews. Guided by Pastor A.N.D.R. Trock's conviction. We do not know what a Jew is. We only know they are human. In Belgium, Yvonne Vergian, director of a childcare organization, placed Jewish children in monasteries and foster homes, saving over 4,000 lives. Each act of shelter was punishable by death. And yet, they did it anyway. The sound of boots for those in hiding. Sound itself became a weapon. A cough, a sneeze, a misplaced chair could betray them. A hidden family in Prague W recalled. We learned to breed like mice. Even the walls seemed to listen when searches came. There was no time for farewell, only instinct. Children were told to hide in cupboards, under floorboards, inside haylofts. Many never emerged. From a survivor in Belgium. We lived beneath the stairs. My mother told me stories to drown out the noise above. One night, the story stopped. Betrayal and courage, in it every rescuer was faithful, and not every betrayal was born of malice. In the desperation of occupation, hunger and fear twisted morality. Some betrayed their hidden neighbors for food, safety, or a reward. The line between victim and villain blurred in the fog of survival. But courage, too, had many faces. A Catholic priest smuggling false baptismal certificates. A schoolteacher erasing Jewish names from records. A farmer who dug a cellar and called it the second house of God, from a rescuer's post to a letter. I was not brave. I was simply unwilling to live knowing I had done nothing. The deportations and the end of the ghettos be 1943. The ghettos were being liquidated. Entire communities were loaded into trains bound for camps whose names the world would never forget: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. Each train carried thousands. Each station a final goodbye to the known world. From the last entry in Adam Cherniak W's diary. Chairman of the Warsaw Judenrat. July 1942. They demand we provide 6,000 souls today. I cannot. My heart is broken. Hours later. He took his own life. Those who resisted did so with impossible courage. In 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising erupted, a desperate fight by the starving and the unarmed against tanks and fire. It was not a battle to win. It was a statement that even condemned people could choose how they would face the end. Echoes in the silence when liberation finally came. The silence was unbearable. Entire neighborhoods were empty. Synagogues stood as hollow shells. Letters waited for owners who would never return. From a note found in a ruined attic in France. If you find this, we were here. We lived. We loved. Do not forget us. Of Europe's 9 million Jews before the war, 6 million were gone. And yet memory became their final rebellion. Through diaries, testimonies, and stories whispered to survivors' children, they refused to be erased. The occupation sought to turn human beings into shadows, but even shadows leave a trace when the light returns. Their words remain not as ghosts, but as witnesses. The long night ends. Liberation and the reckoning. The occupation did not end with a single victory cry. It ended in fragments, in the sudden silence of retreating boots, in the sight of abandoned flags, in the hesitant steps of people emerging from years of fear across Europe, Asia, and beyond. Liberation came like dawn breaking through fog, hesitant, uneven, uncertain. And for millions who had survived under occupation, freedom felt both unreal and unbearable. The first moments of liberation when Allied forces entered the villages and cities once strangled by the occupier. They found a landscape haunted by the living dot in France. Resistance fighters rushed from the forests, their tricolor armbands glinting in sunlight for the first time in years. In Poland, survivors stumbled from bunkers and ruins, their eyes blinking against the open sky. In the Netherlands, starving civilians lined the streets, cheering and weeping as Canadian tanks rolled through. A Dutch diary from May 1945 reads, "The soldiers gave us chocolate." I had forgotten the taste of joy, but liberation also revealed what had been hidden: the scale of starvation, of collaboration, of murder. Freedom had arrived, but it had come too late for so many. The shock of what was found as Allied forces advanced. They uncovered the true machinery of occupation's horror. In France and Belgium, empty prisons filled with bullet holes and bloodstained walls. In Eastern Europe, towns without Jews, villages razed, mass graves marked only by silence. And in Germany, Poland, Austria, the gates of the concentration camps. A British soldier entering Bergen-Belsen in April 1945 wrote in his journal, "We did not understand at first what we were seeing. The smell, the eyes, they were beyond words." Another, from Darko, "The living were too weak to speak. They reached out their hands, not to thank us, but to prove they were still human." The images seared themselves into the world's conscience. Liberation was no longer only a military victory, it was a moral awakening. Return to the ruins, but for civilians emerging from years of occupation. Freedom was only the beginning of another struggle. They returned to towns that no longer existed, to houses looted or destroyed, to families scattered or gone in Warsaw. A woman's diary reads, "I came back to find only my mother's comb in the ashes. That is all that remains of our home." In Normandy, farmers plowed fields still filled with the bones of strangers. In Greece, villages burned by reprisals now stood in silence, their surviving children too young to remember a time before fear. The human mind could not simply switch off the habit of terror. Even in peace, the echo of boots remained, the reckoning with collaborators as freedom returned. So too came the reckoning. Every occupied country faced its own question: who had resisted, who had collaborated, and who had merely survived. In France, the Puration Sauvage, the wild purge, swept through towns and cities. Women accused of fraternizing with German soldiers had their heads shaved in public squares. Men suspected of collaboration were beaten, imprisoned, or shot without trial. From a French observer's diary. August 1944. We are free again. But something dark has taken root in us. We punish to feel clean. In Norway, Quislings, the name given to traitors after Vidkun Quisling faced trial and execution. In the Netherlands, collaborators were stripped of citizenship, and in the Soviet Union, returning POWs and civilians from occupied regions were often accused of treason, punished for having survived. Justice and vengeance blurred. Occupation had left not only physical ruins but moral ones. The displaced and the lost. The end of the occupation did not mean a return to normalcy. For millions, there was nowhere to go back to. Across Europe, the landscape filled with the displaced persons camps holding survivors, refugees, and those who no longer knew where home was. From a letter written by a Polish woman in 1946, "They call it liberation, but I am still behind fences. I have no country, no family, only a number on a form." Children wandered roads searching for parents. Families returned to homes occupied by strangers. Ethnic Germans fled the east as borders shifted and retribution followed. The war had ended, but displacement had only just begun, and for many, the sense of occupation, of being trapped by forces beyond their control, would last for years more. The psychological aftermath. How do you learn to live again after years of submission, fear, and betrayal? How does a mind conditioned to silence find its voice? In occupied Belgium, a schoolteacher wrote after liberation, "I cannot sleep. Every creak of wood feels like footsteps. My students laugh, but I still whisper." A Dutch mother confessed in her diary, "My son plays in the street, and I call him back. I cannot bear the sound of his joy, it feels dangerous." For survivors of the occupation, freedom was haunted by guilt for living when others had died, for having kept silent, for having compromised. The war had turned ordinary people into prisoners of conscience. Liberation freed their bodies, but not their memories, truth, and memory in the years that followed. The occupied nations began to write their own histories, sometimes in shame, sometimes in silence. For a time, people preferred to remember the heroes, not the victims, the resistance, not the collaboration, but the diaries, letters, and testimonies left behind refused to let the truth fade. From France to Poland, from the Netherlands to Greece, ordinary men and women began to speak. They told of hunger, of fear, of betrayal and endurance, of how the occupation had changed not only their world, but their souls. It was through their words that nations began to heal, not through pride, but through honesty. The meaning of liberation was not just the end of the occupier's rule. It was the rebirth of the human spirit, fragile, scarred, but unbroken. For those who had lived under the weight of oppression, freedom was not a flag or a parade. It was the ability to speak one's name again without fear, to open a door without listening first, to sleep without hiding. From a French widow's letter, 1945, the war is over. My husband is gone, but I can hang laundry in the sunlight again. That is my victory. And so, the long night ended, not with triumph, but with quiet resilience, the kind that rebuilds nations from the rubble of silence. In the next chapter, the scars of occupation would not disappear. They would shape the peace to come, because the war may have ended, but the memory of what it meant to live under occupation would echo for generations. Echoes of the past, healing memory, and the legacy of occupation when the guns finally fell silent. The world looked the same, but it wasn't. The fields grew green again. The cities rebuilt. The flags rose high. Yet beneath the surface of peace, something deep and invisible remained. The scars of occupation were not etched in stone or steel. They lived within people, within memories, within silence. The weight of survival in the years that followed 1945. Survivors across occupied Europe faced a different kind of struggle, not for food, not for shelter, but for meaning. The world called it peace. But for those who had lived in fear, peace was not the same as healing. A Polish woman wrote in 1946, I survived, but I do not know how to live among the living. I listen for the sound of boots that no longer come. In France, a resistance career confessed. They gave me medals, but all I can see are the faces of the ones who didn't make it. Liberation freed their bodies, but their souls were still trapped in the shadows of occupation. The silence of the civilian. In the post-war years, the great narratives of victory often drowned out the smaller voices, the mothers who starved in silence, the children who hid under floorboards, the old men who pretended not to hear the screams next door. For a long time, the civilians of occupied territories were not called heroes. They were simply survivors. In Holland, a teacher wrote in her journal, I did not fight. I only tried to feed my students. I wonder if that counts for anything. In Greece, villagers rebuilt their homes stone by stone, never speaking of what had happened, as if forgetting might somehow cleanse the past. But the truth has a way of resurfacing like roots breaking through concrete. And when the next generation began to ask questions, the silence finally began to crack. Memory as resistance through diaries, letters, and whispered stories. The voices of occupation began to find their way into the world again. They became more than recollections, they became acts of resistance against forgetting. From Poland's secret archives, from French attics, from Dutch journals hidden under floorboards, a chorus of the once voiceless began to speak. A German scholar later wrote, History is not made only by generals and governments. It is made by the hands that buried the dead, the hearts that waited in the dark. Each diary became a monument not of marble or bronze, but of truth. Through them, we hear the beating pulse of a humanity that refused to be extinguished, rebuilding trust after occupation. The hardest thing to rebuild wasn't the cities, it was trust. Neighbors who had once betrayed neighbors now stood side by side at markets and schools. Former collaborators walked the same streets as resistance heroes, and no one could quite say who had done what or why. The fabric of society, once torn by suspicion, took decades to mend. In every occupied country, the past lingered in whispers and glances. A French post-war memoir reads, We pretended to forgive, but deep down, we only pretended to forget. In the Soviet-occupied East, new regimes replaced old ones, and the language of freedom was again twisted into the vocabulary of control. The shadow of occupation had only changed its flag. The children of occupation for the children born during the war. The occupation became a memory inherited, not lived, but its echoes shaped their lives in ways they could not see. A Dutch boy, now grown, wrote decades later, I never heard a gunshot, yet every time my mother heard thunder, she hid in the cellar. In France, Some children discovered as adults that their fathers were German soldiers. Their very existence carried the mark of the occupation's moral confusion. They became living reminders of what war had done to intimacy, to trust, to identity itself. But many of them born of silence, shame, or survival grew up to tell the stories their parents could not. They became the keepers of memory, not its prisoners, from trauma to testimony by the late 20th century. The survivors of occupation, now elderly, began to speak openly for the first time. Museums, memorials, and oral history projects across Europe began collecting their voices. What had once been private pain became public history, from the oral testimony of a French woman recorded in 1983. I used to think my suffering was too small to matter. But when I spoke, others wept. That is when I understood none of us were alone, and so, the story of the occupied territories became not only a chronicle of endurance, but a lesson for all who would come after, that tyranny can take many forms, that silence can be as deadly as violence, and that even in the darkest corners of history, the human spirit finds ways to whisper we were here. The legacy in our time today, the landscapes of occupation have been rebuilt. Warsaw's skyline gleams. Paris thrives. Amsterdam's canals flow quietly again. But under the cobblestones lie the memories of those who walked in fear, starved, resisted, or simply endured. Monuments stand where the walls once did. Names etched in stone remind us that history is not just about battles won, but about lives interrupted. Every time a student opens a wartime diary, every time a family tells the story of a hidden child, every time a village remembers its dead, the occupation loosens its grip on memory. From a German historian's reflection, true victory over tyranny lies not in conquest, but in remembrance. Epilogue: the human cost. The human strength occupation was not just a political act. It was a human experience, one of hunger, fear, courage, and quiet endurance. From France to Greece, from Norway to the Philippines, millions learned that survival itself was an act of defiance. A Dutch survivor, interviewed at age 90, said softly, "They took everything from us, but not the will to remain human. That is the true legacy of the occupied, not defeat, not victimhood, but the unbreakable thread of humanity that binds generation to generation." History often remembers the conquerors, but it is in the stories of the conquered that we find the essence of civilization, the fragile, luminous truth that even under the boots of occupation, the human soul endures. If these voices moved you, if these memories reminded you of what it means to be free, then carry them forward. Share their stories, because every time we remember, we keep their courage alive. This has been War's Unseen Scars, Civilian Trauma in Occupied Territories, a tribute to those who endured the unimaginable and to the memory that outlived tyranny itself.